Okay, so when we are stripe matching, the most important thing is when you are cutting out your fabric and making sure you are lining it up so the stripes are matching, and then making sure you are cutting out all the pieces the same. So we're going to start out by cutting this bad boy out. And it can get a little finicky depending on your material. If your stripes are thinner, they're harder to match depending on your material. Some material is harder than others, depending on where your fabric is from. Some stripes will actually be a little bit slanted depending on the type of material. But the thicker the stripe, the easier it's going to be to stripe match. So if you're new to stripe matching, definitely go with a wider stripe. And for me, for thinner stripes, I don't even bother stripe matching. Another thing too is with your fabric, sometimes the selvage can be tighter than the rest of your fabric. And so sometimes I'll go in and just snip that off with my rotary cutter just to make it a little bit easier. This one's really not that tight, but I'm going to do it anyway. I just take it off right at the selvage. And also, if you are stripe matching, depending on what option you're doing, you may need more fabric than what the fabric requirements are. So definitely keep that in mind. Definitely is a lot longer to do stripe matching just because you got to be a little finicky with it to make sure it's lining up just how you want it. So what I like to do is have a point on your fabric that you're cutting out to make it easier to line up. So sometimes I'll do a stripe on the very bottom hem. Sometimes I'll do a stripe right at the top of the arm sky, or the bottom of the arm sky, right at the top of that side seam. That way I can easily line up the other bodice piece to match up. So this looks pretty good. You can also peel it back and take a peek at it, slightly pick it up and adjust it over. But it's mainly the most important that your stripes are matching where your seam line is going to be, since that's where it really is going to matter when you sew it together. So since this looks pretty good, I'm going to go ahead and cut out my bodice. This is the back piece, and I am using my projector. So I'm going to go ahead and I think I will just do a hemmed reversion. And so I'm going to move this up so it's along my hemline. And also, I always have to grade my hips down according to my measurements. So since I'm making the 0-2, I need to grade down. I just slide my pattern piece over to the 4-6 line, and then I will trim on that 0-2 line again and that will grate it in for me. And that looks pretty good. And so we'll just put this aside. For the sleeve, we're going to be doing the same general thing. I like to take my front or back pieces and look to see where the end of that arm sky is and try to cut out the sleeve so it sort of matches that, but it's not necessary. I feel like it's more important that both sleeve pieces are the same rather than it matching up with your bodice. And so again, like with the front and back piece, you can either start by making sure the bottom of your hem matches up with one of your stripes, or with your arm sky, if that's going to match up to your bottom, or with your bodice. But I'm going to go ahead and try to do a little bit of both. So I have it on the light blue. You want to make sure that both sides of your arm sky, or the bottom of each sleeve cap, is matching up the same on the stripe, as well as the bottom matching up the same. So again, you may need to stretch out your fabric a little bit, make sure it's all stretching evenly. One side isn't pulling more than the other. And so for this particular one, I always like to do sleeve cuffs on my long sleeves. It's just my personal preference, so that's what I'm going to cut. And so right now I matched this up so the bottom line is the same, and then moving this around so it's flat but still the same on both the top, the bottom of the arm, of the sleeve caps. And I don't like to cut my sleeves at the same time, just because it's harder to make them 100% identical when you can't exactly see where they are. And so I'll go ahead and cut it out. And since sew little seam patterns, or at least for the sleeve, for the Constance, it is cut open, so there is a difference between the front and the back of the sleeve cap. And so you want to make sure that you put a pin or a mark on that top marker where you will line up your sleeve with your shoulder seam. Then I also put a mark just anywhere on the front, just so I know that this is the front and this is the back. So the one with the pin is the front. And set that sleeve aside. And then for this one, flip it around to make sure that they are two mirrored images. So this is where sometimes you might need more or less fabric for stripes. For instance, if I didn't have as many stripes and my first blue line wasn't until down here, I'd have to move all this up and waste all this fabric to make sure my sleeves are identical. But luckily I don't have to waste that much for this, since I can use this blue, light blue stripe. So I'm going to do exactly what I did before. Make sure these are lining up in the right spot, the bottom of the sleeve cap as well as the bottom hem that I did, or the bottom of the sleeve. So I went just to the bottom barely of the white stripe. It's okay if it's not perfect. Close is better than really off, in my opinion, because you can kind of fudge it a little bit when you sew it, as long as your stripes are very close to matching. We'll do the same thing with this sleeve. I'm going to put a pin right here at this shoulder mark, and as well as a pin at the front marking, so I know which is the front and the back. So now that is done, so I'm going to put it aside. And then I'll just quickly cut out my cuffs. The same thing with your sleeve cuffs. I just like to line them up on one of the stripes. With this one, I will line up to the top blue one. And you can be a little finicky with making sure your cuff will match up to this bottom of the stripe that is on your sleeve. That way those match up, but I don't always bother doing that, as long as both of my cuffs are the same. So since I have the top of the blue on this one, I'll just slide this over. Do the blue on this side. And then the last thing we need to do is cut out our neckband. Luckily, no stripe matching really is required. So the main thing for your neckband is just making sure, so there's two ways to do it. You can either cut out one half and then cut out the other half. That way you make sure that your stripes are lining up, or just make sure they are matching before you cut them, like we did with the bodice. So let me grab my front piece. So my front piece, my stripe is the black and then the green. So I typically like to pick a specific color that's going to show. And so maybe I'll do black. Make black be along the bottom, along the main part of the neckline. So I'll line up my black stripe. When you are stripe matching, the first important thing you need to do is cut out your fabric so it'll be as easy as possible to match up your stripes. So what I did here is you can see that both my top of my side seams are the same on the stripe, and I went all the way down here and they're the same ending stripe. And so when we pin those together, it'll be easier to match up these. If this one was on the dark blue and this one was on the light blue, it's it's going to be almost impossible to match up those stripes. So it's really important that you make sure you cut it out properly and as close to identical as possible before you start sewing it up. So that's the number one thing, is making sure they are cut out properly. So with both of those cut out, we are now going to start sewing those together with our shoulder seams. So I'm going to go sew those, and then I'm going to come back. With our shoulder seams sewn, we are now going to start by pinning our sleeves to our bodice. So again, you should have marked your shoulder seam as well as the front on both of your sleeve pieces. So I like to open it up. So that's the wrong sleeve. This is the right sleeve, since this is the bigger scoop. This is the front. Start off by pinning that shoulder seam. Once those 3 spots on our sleeve are all pinned, I like to flip it around. And then you will slightly stretch to get it to match up. I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing on the other side. Now with both sleeves sewn on, go ahead and sew that on, and then we'll come back. With the sleeves now sewn on, you can go ahead and take a look at your stripes. You can see it's really pretty tricky to be able to get sleeve stripes to match up perfectly, but I did get one stripe. So these light blue and dark blue ones matched up, but none of the other ones did. It's pretty tricky to get them to perfectly match on a sleeve, but the rest of it is really where we want them to match. So put your fabric right side together. We're going to be pinning quite a bit for this. So when you are matching up your stripes, it is more important that your seam line, so for this it will be 3/8 of an inch in from the raw edge. It's more important that that spot is matching up rather than the raw edge. So just keep that in mind when you are pinning your striped fabric together. So I'm going to start off at the bottom, and see how I have a little bit of blue, dark blue, left over on this side. I'm just going to match up to where my light blue. So it's just going to overhang just a little bit. So this is where I was saying that if you cut it out, you can kind of be a little, you can kind of fudge it a little bit after it's cut. So that's one spot where I'm going to fudge it a little bit, because it'll allow me to have all these other stripes to be able to match a little bit better rather than stretching it out too much. So I like to pin a little bit more when I'm stripe matching than when I am normally sewing something together, just to make sure everything is in line. So I'm just going to go every couple of stripes. I'm just going to put in another pin right on that stripe. Now when you get up here to the top of the seam, sometimes it won't totally line up depending on if your serger happened to slightly cut off a little bit more or a little less, depending on if you started or ended it. And so I kind of don't worry about the top right here as much. So I'm just going to match up my seams and not worry about that one stripe lining up. And we do the same thing for the sleeve. And we just repeat that same thing on the other side. Now go ahead and sew those up, and then we'll come back. Once both side seams are sewn, it is now time for the big reveal. Let's go ahead and flip that right side out. Go ahead and take a look at your seam. You can see some places are better than others, but for the most part, no one's going to be looking that close anyway. But it's pretty dang good. I told you right here it would be a little iffy, but that's fine. No one's going to be looking under your armpit anyway. And then sleeve. That's pretty dang good. Let's look at the other side. Not too bad. Again, armpit looks a little wonky, but it's okay. Everything else looks pretty good. That's pretty much it. For stripe matching, you just sew your cuffs and neckband how you normally would. Not really anything to those. But yeah, that's it. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. And that's it.
To stay up to date on the latest videos, be sure to subscribe to my channel, or you can check out my blog at sewingandthings.com.